All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be jumping headfirst into a question that's, well, it's a bit of a head scratcher. It's one that's been keeping philosophers up at night for centuries.
Oh, I can attest to that. Many late nights spent pondering this one.
Yeah, I bet. It's the question of political obligation. In the simplest terms, is there like a moral duty to follow the law just because it's the law, the law of the land?
Hmm. It does seem simple on the surface, doesn't it? But trust me, once you start peeling back the layers, it quickly turns into this fascinating, tangled web of arguments, counter-arguments, you name it.
Exactly. And right at the heart of this whole debate are some really, really fundamental questions. Like, how do we even get this duty in the first place? Is it something we do? Voting, agreeing to a contract, something like that? Or does it just come from being part of a political community?
Yeah, those are the million-dollar questions. And the truly mind-boggling part is, even after centuries of, increasingly sophisticated philosophical back and forth, all the way from Socrates to today, we still haven't landed on a universally accepted answer.
That's wild.
It is. The debate rages on not just about whether political obligation actually exists, but about the very foundations on which it could possibly stand. It's like trying to build a house on shifting sand.
So today, in our deep dive, we're going to be taking a journey through some of the key moments in this debate.
Absolutely.
We're going to look at some of the big names from history who wrestled with this very question.
The titans of thought, some might say.
We'll dig into the really nitty-gritty of the concepts involved.
Yeah.
We're going to confront this really radical challenge from philosophical anarchism.
Oh, yeah. That'll shake things up a bit.
And then we're going to take a look at the main theories that are still very much alive and kicking in today's philosophical landscape. We'll even consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there isn't one single answer that we should be searching for.
It's a rich and complex field, to say the least.
Mm.
And our goal today is really to distill those core arguments, the essential insights, the things that any philosopher thinking about this topic would absolutely need to wrap their head around.
Perfect.
We're not aiming for an exhaustive encyclopedia entry here, more of a focused exploration, really diving deep into those most influential viewpoints on political obligation.
Okay, great. So let's rewind the clock all the way back to ancient Athens. And, well, it's one of philosophy's most iconic scenes, right? Socrates facing his death sentence in Plato's Crito. He had a chance to escape, didn't he? So why did he choose to stay and accept his fate?
Yeah, that's the question that's haunted philosophers for ages. It's a real puzzle.
It is.
So Socrates, in Crito, he lays out a series of, interconnected arguments for why he believes he has this moral obligation to obey Athenian law, even when, deep down he feels the verdict against him was totally unjust. One of the key points he makes is about his long time living in Athens, his residence. He basically suggests that by choosing to stay in Athens for so many years, enjoying all the perks that came with it, participating in society, he had kind of, in a way, implicitly agreed, entered into a commitment to play by the rules, to abide by the laws. And this, it's really early, but it's like a very early glimpse of what would later become the fully formed social contract theory.
Interesting. So it's like just by setting down roots somewhere, you're kind of almost signing this invisible contract.
That's the implication that Socrates is drawing out. And it's interesting because it raises the question of whether we even need an explicit contract, right? Like, do our actions speak louder than words in a sense? But Socrates, he doesn't stop there. He goes on to emphasize this deep debt of gratitude that he feels he owes to Athens. The city nurtured him, educated him, provided him with the very foundation for his life and his philosophical pursuits.
It's almost like he's drawing an analogy to the kind of duty a child might feel to their parents, isn't it? Like suggesting there's this inherent obligation that just comes from being part of the Athenian community, being raised and supported by it.
Yeah, precisely. And it's this idea of a dump connection to the community, a sense of belonging and responsibility that's really at the heart of associative theories of political obligation.
Right, right. I see the family-like relationship he's getting at. And then there's his argument about fairness, right?
Absolutely. The fair play argument, this one's really interesting. Socrates basically argues that if he were to just, disregard the court's decision and skip town, he'd essentially be a free rider, benefiting from everyone else's compliance with the law while refusing to accept the consequences when they apply to him. He's benefited from everyone else obeying, so it's only fair that he does the same, even when it's tough. He even puts it directly to Crito, asking, if we leave here without the city's permission, are we mistreating people whom we should least mistreat?
It makes you think, right? You can't just pick and choose when you want to follow the rules. There's this idea that participating in a society means accepting the good with the bad.
Exactly. And this idea of fairness, it's incredibly powerful.
Mm.
But it raises tricky questions for us, for philosophers trying to pin down this idea of political obligation. Like, how much benefit do you need to receive before this obligation kicks in? Is simply existing in a society enough? Or do you need to be actively participating, consciously accepting those benefits?
Right.
It's almost like that unspoken rule you have at a potluck, you know. You benefit from everyone bringing a dish, so it's only fair that you bring something too. Political obligation, in this sense, it's our contribution to the potluck of a functioning society.
I like that analogy. It makes it very relatable. And lastly, with Socrates, there's also this kind of early, almost utilitarian consideration, even though it's not fully formed.
Right, right. He sort of imagines the laws themselves talking to him, asking him, hey, Socrates, can a city even survive? Can it function if its legal judgments are ignored, if they're meaningless because anyone can just choose to disregard them? And, you know, it's this very practical point about the necessity of upholding the legal system for the very existence of the state.
It makes you think about the potential chaos if everyone just decided to follow their own rules.
Exactly. Now, of course, you know, philosophers being philosophers, these are all very preliminary forms of arguments. They're suggestive. They point towards deeper ideas, but they're just the tip of the iceberg. They contain these foundational intuitions, but later theories would take those intuitions and really develop them in a much more rigorous and detailed way.
And speaking of developing ideas, let's fast forward a bit. Now we come to this idea of divine command. For a long, long time, this was a super influential perspective, wasn't it? The belief that political authority came straight from God.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
For centuries, the idea that the rules, the political order, everything was divinely ordained. It was so strong, so ingrained that people probably didn't even question it all that much. It was just a given. Obedience was a religious duty. But then Christianity came along, and it introduced a potential wrinkle.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. Jesus, with his whole render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's thing, it kind of opened up this possibility that earthly laws could clash with God's will.
Exactly. That distinction, it really threw a wrench in the gears.
Yeah.
So you have this tension, right? Because you also have figures like Paul in the Bible who seem to be arguing pretty strongly for obedience to earthly rulers.
Right.
And his letter to the Romans, it's really a key text here. Paul says straight up that the authorities that exist, they're put there by God. And so resisting them is basically the same as resisting God's plan.
Mm-hmm.
And this, you know, it provided a really powerful framework for this divine command theory of political obligation. But from a philosophical standpoint, this theory runs into some pretty big obstacles.
Yeah, I can imagine. For starters, you have to accept that there even is a God or gods issuing these commands.
Exactly. That's a huge assumption right off the bat.
Yeah.
And even if you do accept that, figuring out exactly what those divine commands are in every specific political situation, it's not exactly a walk in the park. It's
Yeah.
not like God's handing out a detailed rule book for every political scenario.
Yeah, it's one thing to say obey God, but translating that into concrete political action is a whole other challenge.
Exactly. And this became super problematic when you had rulers who were hostile to Christian beliefs, or later on during the Reformation, when different interpretations of Christianity started popping up everywhere. Christians were stuck with this really tough question.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do when the people in charge seem to be going against God's will?
Right, a real moral dilemma.
Yeah. And different answers emerged.
Mm.
Some said you just had to endure these bad rulers, that it was God's punishment or a test of faith. Others tried to separate the divinely ordained position of the ruler from the actual person holding that position, suggesting that you could disobey a tyrannical king without rejecting the entire idea of kingship.
Right, so you could say, the king's a jerk, but the institution of monarchy is still divinely ordained.
Exactly. And some even went further, drawing distinctions between just disobeying and actively resisting. Like, refusing to pay unjust taxes might be okay, but actively rebelling, that's a whole different story.
Mm-hmm.
So as these challenges to divine authority kept piling up, philosophers started looking elsewhere for the basis of political obligation. And this is where things get really interesting.
Yeah, it seems like this internal struggle within the divine command framework, especially during the Reformation, really set the stage for a move towards this different kind of justification for political power, the social contract.
Precisely. As religious authority began to fragment and the idea of divinely appointed rulers lost its grip, thinkers started exploring this idea that maybe, just maybe, political authority, and with it political obligation, comes from the agreement of the people being governed, It's like flipping the script, right?
Mm.
Instead of looking to the heavens for justification, they started looking to each other.
A real power shift. And while the concept of the social contract existed before, it really took off in the 17th century with thinkers like Hobbes and Locke, though they used it to justify very different political systems, right?
Oh, absolutely. Hobbes, with his rather, shall we say, pessimistic view of human nature, his famous line about the state of nature being solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, he argued that without government, life would be a constant, brutal struggle for power. And the only way out of this mess, he thought, was to enter into a contract to give up some of that individual freedom for the security of living under a sovereign ruler. He called this sovereignty by institution, where people consciously create a government. But interestingly, he also had this idea of sovereignty by acquisition, where a conqueror gains legitimacy simply by being powerful enough to enforce their rule and letting people live. In both cases, for Hobbes, the obligation to obey came from the consent of the governed to submit to whoever had the power.
So it sounds like for Hobbes, it's a very practical kind of obligation. You obey whoever's in charge because the alternative is chaos, anarchy. And this basic need for order, it trumps all other considerations. It's like choose your poison, a dictator or a war of all against all.
Exactly. It's a rather bleak picture, but, he was writing in a time of tremendous upheaval and civil war. So it makes sense in a way. Locke, on the other hand, he had a bit more, a more optimistic view. And his concept of the contract, it was a bit more intricate, a bit more nuanced.
Yeah, Locke saw the state of nature as having inconveniences, problems to solve, but not necessarily a constant bloodbath like Hobbes envisioned. For Locke, the purpose of government was to overcome those inconveniences and, crucially, to protect those natural rights that he believed everyone possessed.
Right. And for Locke, the social contract, it involved two stages. First, you have individuals agreeing to come together and form a political society, and then this society sets up a government to enforce the rules.
So it's not just a one-time deal, it's a process.
Exactly. And this two-stage model, it allowed Locke to argue for the right of revolution, that if the government failed to uphold its end of the bargain, the people had a right to overthrow it. And that's a huge point of disagreement with Hobbes, who basically said that any ruler is better than no ruler.
Interesting. So for Locke, the government's power is conditional. It's based on the ongoing consent of the governed.
Precisely. And unlike Hobbes, Locke didn't consider simply submitting to a conqueror to be a real form of consent. For him, genuine consent had to be more than just giving in to force.
But even with their differences, both Hobbes and Locke saw consent as the bedrock of political obligation. And this is where some of the major philosophical challenges to the whole idea of a social contract start to emerge.
Oh, absolutely. One of the biggest problems is, well, the nature of the contract itself. Was it an actual historical event, something that actually happened? Or is it just a hypothetical thought experiment, a story we tell ourselves to justify political authority?
Yeah, if it's historical, it's pretty hard to prove that everyone, or even most people, actually agree to anything. And if it's hypothetical, if it's just a story, then the critique is that, well, a story doesn't necessarily create actual obligations in the real world.
Exactly. And then there's the whole question of what even counts as consent. Hobbes's idea of submission as consent, that's largely rejected by most philosophers.
Yeah.
And even Locke's idea of tacit consent, the idea that you consent just by living somewhere, that's been criticized pretty heavily, most famously by Hume, who compared it to someone being carried onto a ship while they're asleep and then being told they've consented to the journey because they didn't jump overboard.
I remember that analogy. It's pretty powerful. And Hume, ever the skeptic, he argued that utility, the usefulness of a system of laws for peaceful coexistence, that was the real basis for our obligation to obey, not some imaginary contract from the past.
Right. Hume believed we obey the law because it generally works. It benefits society as a whole, not because of some ancient agreement. But while utilitarianism, this focus on maximizing overall happiness or well-being, has been incredibly influential in lots of areas of philosophy, it actually has a pretty hard time providing a solid basis for political obligation in the general sense.
Because utilitarianism is all about the greatest good for the greatest number, right? So if breaking a particular law in a specific situation would lead to a better outcome, a utilitarian might say, go ahead and break it, even if there's this supposed duty to obey.
Exactly. Utilitarianism, at its core, it struggles with the concept of obligation, period. If the ultimate goal is always to maximize utility, then obligations, they kind of lose their binding power. Why should you pay back a debt if giving that money to charity would produce more happiness overall?
Right. It becomes a calculation, not a duty.
Exactly. Obedience to the law becomes all about weighing the potential consequences, not sticking to a moral principle. Some utilitarians have tried to square this circle, to find ways to fit obligations into their system. But generally, there's this consensus that attempts to ground political obligations solely on utilitarian grounds, they haven't really been successful.
Okay, so we've seen some of the challenges that arise when you try to ground a political obligation on consent or utility alone. Now let's bring in another big name, someone who's had a huge influence, even if it's sometimes a bit confusing. Kant. He's actually inspired both those who reject the idea of political obligation completely and those who argue for a strong natural duty to obey the law. It's like he straddles both sides of the fence.
Yeah, Kant is a tricky one, always full of surprises.
Hmm.
He uses a lot of the same concepts as Hobbes and Locke, natural rights, the state of nature, the social contract. But he uses them in his own unique way. Unlike Hobbes, he doesn't see law as limiting freedom, but as a necessary way to secure and expand it. It's about preventing people from interfering with each other's legitimate actions. And for Kant, this civil condition created by the social contract, it's not just about convenience or protecting your stuff, like Locke might say. It's a moral imperative to create a just society, one where rights and duties are properly distributed.
So for Kant, it's not just about getting people to agree to be governed. It's about this moral obligation to move away from a lawless state of nature towards a just legal order.
Exactly. He even says that the original contract, it's more of a regulative idea. It's like a blueprint, a standard we can use to judge the legitimacy of a state. And this has a seemingly pretty extreme implication, because for Kant, it means everyone has a duty to obey the existing authorities, even if the ruler is a tyrant. You can complain, sure, but you can't actively resist.
That sounds pretty authoritarian on the surface. It seems to clash with his whole emphasis on autonomy and other areas of his philosophy. How can you be both completely obligated to obey the law and truly free to make your own moral choices?
Yeah, it's a tension that a lot of Kant scholars wrestle with. But there are nuances here. He does argue that the underlying spirit of this original contract implies that the authorities have to govern justly to live up to this ideal of a rightful condition. And he definitely prefers a system where the law itself is supreme, not any particular individual. He calls this a pure republic, where no one is above the law.
Okay, so it's not as black and white as it might seem at first glance. There's room for criticism and for pushing towards a more just system, even if outright rebellion is off the table.
Exactly. And, this inherent tension in his thought is what makes Kant's influence so enduring and so debated. He gives us a lot to chew on.
Okay, so we've taken this whirlwind tour through some of the big historical perspectives on political obligation. Now let's zoom in a bit and look at some of the core concepts that are really central to this whole debate. First up, obligation and duty. In this context, are they basically just interchangeable terms, or is there a subtle distinction there?
It's a good question. For the most part, when philosophers are talking about political obligation and duty are used pretty much interchangeably. They're both seen as this moral requirement to follow the law. But there have been attempts to separate them, to draw some finer distinctions.
I can imagine that can get pretty complex.
Oh yeah, it can. Some philosophers argue that obligations have to be voluntary, like the obligation to keep a promise that you made freely. Duties, on the other hand, might not require a voluntary action, like the duty to be charitable, to help those in need.
Okay, I'm starting to see the difference.
Right. And Rawls, for example, he makes this distinction between a political obligation to obey the law, which he thinks most people in a reasonably just state actually don't have, and this natural duty to support just institutions, which he thinks pretty much everyone has. But despite these attempts to separate the two, the dominant view in discussions of political obligation is that a political obligation is essentially a moral duty to obey the law.
And that brings us to another distinction. Political obligation versus legal obligation. These seem like terms that could easily get mixed up. What's the key difference there?
That's a crucial question. And honestly, it's one that trips up a lot of people. So legal obligation, it's often seen by legal theorists as just a description of a social fact. The law says you have to do X and that's it. But having this legal obligation to do X, it only gives you a moral reason to do it if you also have a moral duty to obey the law in the first place, if you have that political obligation.
Yeah, okay, so it's like the difference between being legally required to do something and feeling morally compelled to do it.
Exactly. And this distinction, it's important because it lets us say that, even in a dictatorship, people might have legal obligations, but we wouldn't necessarily say they have a moral duty to follow those laws, especially if those laws are unjust or oppressive. We could argue they have no political obligation to obey.
Right, that makes sense. There's a difference between obeying because you have to and obeying because you believe it's the right thing to do.
Precisely. And Bhikkhu Parekh, he's a political theorist, he brings in this concept of civil obligation to describe the duty to respect and uphold legitimate civil authority, which then creates a moral obligation to obey the law. And he sees political obligation as potentially broader than that, it might include duties beyond just obedience, like actively working to make the country a better place.
Right, like being a good citizen, participating in democracy.
Exactly. But there's already this term civic duty that covers a lot of those broader actions, like voting or volunteering. So it's not entirely clear if reclassifying them as political obligations really adds anything new to the discussion.
So, if I'm understanding correctly, political obligation, at least in the sense we're talking about here, it basically boils down to a moral duty to obey the law just because it's the law. It's not because you agree with it or because you're afraid of the consequences if you break it.
You got it. And this brings us to another big conceptual point that philosophers spend a lot of time thinking about. The relationship between obligation, morality, and, well, practical reason. Traditionally, political obligation, it's been framed as a moral issue, a question of right and wrong. And T.H. Green, a philosopher from the 19th century, he really spelled this out in his work on the justification for obedience to law. He wasn't just looking for practical reasons to obey. He wanted to understand the moral foundation of it all.
He was going deeper, looking for the underlying ethical principles.
Exactly. But recently, Margaret Gilbert, she's a contemporary philosopher, she's offered a really interesting challenge to this whole moralized view.
Oh, how so?
Well, she argues that we should try to demoralize our understanding of political obligation. Now, I know that sounds a bit provocative.
It does. It makes you wonder, can you really have an obligation that isn't moral?
Right. And what she's suggesting is that a political obligation, it's a real obligation in the sense that it gives you a sufficient reason to act, but it's separate from what we normally think of as moral requirements. For her, political obligation comes from this idea of owing something to others because you're all jointly committed to being part of a political community. It's like a debt you owe to your fellow citizens.
It's like a social bond, a commitment to the group.
Right. But here's the thing. Her view could mean that even in really unjust systems where people are basically forced to obey, there might still be this owing obligation because of their shared commitment to the political entity.
That raises some really thorny ethical questions, doesn't it? I mean, can you really call something an obligation if it's created under duress?
Absolutely. And that's where the critics come in. They argue that Gilbert's account, it might be a good way to explain how we talk about obligations within a political community, but it doesn't really justify them morally. They're like, why should we consider these so-called obligations that come from coercion or unjust systems to be real obligations? Shouldn't they always be overridden by our basic moral principles?
Yeah, it seems like there has to be some kind of moral foundation, some sense of justice or fairness for an obligation to be truly binding.
Right. And this is where the dominant view in political philosophy comes in. Most philosophers still hold that political obligation is a moral duty to obey the law, and it's what's called content independent.
Okay, content independent. That's a key term here. So the obligation to obey, it doesn't depend on whether a particular law is good or bad, just or unjust. It's about the fact that it's the law, period.
Precisely. The source of the obligation, it's in the law itself, not in the content of what the law is actually saying. Think about it like this. A content-independent obligation to obey the law means you obey the law against stealing, not just because stealing is wrong, which is a moral reason tied to the content of the law, but simply because it's the law. The fact that it's a rule, that's where the obligation comes from, regardless of your personal feelings about stealing.
Content independent is a really helpful way to understand this. So it's not about agreeing with the law, it's about respecting the system of laws.
Exactly. Now, even with this idea of content independence, there's still debate about exactly how it works, how we should understand it. Some focus on the intention behind the law, others on the formal structure of legal commands. There's even disagreement about whether political obligations should even be seen as content independent at all.
Philosophers going to philosophize, right? Always digging deeper, finding new angles to explore.
That's what we do. But even with all this debate, the prevailing view is that political obligation, it gives you a prima facie reason to obey. It's like a starting point, a default position. But it can be overridden by other stronger moral reasons in certain situations.
Okay, so it's not an absolute, unquestionable duty. There are exceptions.
Right. Think of it like a general rule of thumb. Usually, You should obey the law. But there might be times when other moral considerations outweigh that duty. And political obligations, they're generally understood to be both general and particular.
Okay, unpack those two for me. What does that mean?
Sure. General means it applies to all the laws, the whole legal system.
Yeah.
It applies to everyone within a specific jurisdiction, everyone who falls under that system of laws. Particular means the obligation is owed specifically to the state that claims authority over you.
Right. So I have an obligation to the laws of the United States because I live in the U.S., not to the laws of, say, France or Brazil.
Exactly. That's the particularity of it. And Simmons, he's a philosopher who's done a lot of work on this. He really emphasizes this point about particularity.
Okay, so we've covered some of the key conceptual ground here. We've talked about what obligation and duty mean in this context, the different types of obligation, this idea of content independence, and the general and particular nature of political obligation. But now it's time to turn our attention to those who say, hold on a minute, what obligation? I don't owe the state anything. We're talking, of course, about the philosophical anarchists.
Ah, yes, the rebels of the philosophical world. These folks, they represent a big shift in the whole debate, right?
Yeah.
It's like moving from just assuming that everyone has a political obligation to really questioning the whole foundation of the idea.
A real paradigm shift.
Exactly. Up until like the mid-20th century, most philosophers just took it for granted that if you were a citizen of a reasonably decent state, you had a political obligation to obey its laws. Some even thought it was almost logically impossible to say otherwise. But then in the 1960s and beyond, these skeptical voices, including these philosophical anarchists, they started gaining ground, challenging this whole unquestioned assumption.
And it makes sense in a way. The 20th century saw so much political turmoil, so many abuses of power. It's natural that people would start to question the very legitimacy of states and their authority.
Absolutely. And while full-blown anarchists, they usually want to get rid of the state entirely, seeing it as inherently immoral and coercive, philosophical anarchists, they're a bit more nuanced. They might not necessarily advocate for tearing down the whole system, but they argue that the state is illegitimate, that it doesn't have the moral right to command us. And that means, of course, we don't have moral duty to obey.
Okay, so they're making a moral argument, not just a practical one. It's not just about inefficiency or inconvenience. It's about the fundamental rightness of state power.
Right. And they get to this conclusion through these two main lines of reasoning, the a priori and the a posteriori arguments.
Ah, yes, the classic philosophical distinction.
Exactly. A priori arguments, they start from first principles, from pure reason, from the very nature of freedom and autonomy. A posteriori arguments, they're more empirical. They look at the evidence, at the historical track record, and they say, look, no one's ever successfully justified this obligation. It's like a detective case, trying to find the missing justification.
And it's worth mentioning that a priori and a posteriori are terms that philosophers use all the time, so it's helpful to have a grasp of what they mean. A priori knowledge is independent of experience. It's something you can know just by thinking about it. A posteriori knowledge comes from observation and experience.
Exactly. So let's start with the a priori arguments. The most famous one is from Robert Paul Wolff, and he basically says that having a general obligation to obey the law is incompatible with our primary obligation of autonomy.
Autonomy, meaning our freedom to make our own choices, to govern ourselves.
Exactly. And Wolff defines autonomy very specifically. He sees it as this synthesis of freedom and responsibility. We're free to choose, but we're also responsible for the choices we make. And for him, any kind of authority, any right to command and be obeyed, it clashes with this fundamental autonomy. The only exception he really allows for is a unanimous direct democracy, where everyone literally agrees on every single law. But let's be real, that's never going to happen in any large-scale society.
Yeah. So for Wolff, any form of government that isn't a perfectly unanimous direct democracy, it's inherently infringing on our moral duty to be self-governing.
That's the core of his argument.
Yeah.
But then you have the a posteriori arguments. And these are, like I said, more grounded in experience. They're not saying it's logically impossible to justify political obligation. They're just saying that no one's done it yet.
Show me the money.
Exactly. And Simmons, he's one of the main proponents of this view. He argues that after, centuries of philosophers trying to crack this nut, no one's come up with a convincing, universally acceptable justification. So he concludes that maybe only those who explicitly commit themselves, like through an oath of citizenship or something, might have a political obligation. And even that, he's not totally sure about.
So the a priori argument says that obligation and authority just don't mix, conceptually speaking, while the a posteriori argument is more like, the proof is in the pudding, where's the evidence? And this challenge from the anarchists It's forced those who do believe in some form of political obligation to up their game to really defend their position.
Oh, absolutely. It's pushed the debate forward in really interesting ways. And those who defend political obligation, they've had to really sharpen their arguments.
And some of those defenses, they focused on questioning Wolff's very definition of autonomy. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Critics of Wolff, they say, look, his view of autonomy, it's too extreme. It's like this all or nothing thing, and it just doesn't work in the real world. We're social creatures. We live in communities. We need some kind of structure, some kind of authority to even develop and exercise our autonomy. And they point out that certain forms of authority, including legitimate political authority, they can actually help us be more autonomous in the long run. They give us the stability and security we need to flourish as individuals.
Right. And they also point out that Wolff himself seems to accept other kinds of obligations, like those from promises and contracts, which also limit our future freedom in a way. So why single out political obligation as uniquely incompatible with autonomy?
Exactly. It's like picking and choosing which obligations are okay, which doesn't seem very consistent.
Yeah.
And then you have Matthew Noah Smith. He's another philosopher. He's tried to refine the a priori skeptical argument by zeroing in on what he calls the moral status of the subject's self.
Okay. What does that mean exactly?
Well, he argues that obeying the law, it requires us to kind of efface ourselves, to put aside our own judgment, and just blindly follow the commands of another. And he thinks this is morally problematic, that it undermines our dignity as autonomous agents.
So it's not just about external freedom, it's about this internal freedom of conscience, the freedom to think for ourselves.
Exactly. But even Smith's argument,